Right, so I did indeed have packed a lot in. So this is just a very quick recap from what we did last week, and also our theme for today, because we're now taking Sorolla forward to this idea of painting out of doors quickly. So here's his rather elegant self-portrait of 1904. We'll come back to this next week, because this was used for the advertisement for his show at the Grafton Galleries in London. It was a landmark exhibition for Sorolla in 1908, but it didn't do his reputation in Britain. It was a sort of poisoned chalice, because unfortunately the big banner above this portrait was the world's best painter. And there were a few people that didn't quite sort of agree with that summary. So it's wise to be modest, I think is the answer to that. So we left Sorolla in Rome, and we're going to rejoin him in Rome. And I was also trying to put him into his context. You know me, I'm one of these people that likes to give you the whole picture. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about his life in Rome and the sort of artistic ambiance he would have been enjoying. And all roads in Spain at this stage lead to Rome and not to Paris. So I've mentioned the Benuri family. This is the son. So he's got his mother's name at the end, Ortiz. And to save confusion, because there are three Benuris, the sculptor is Mariano. I always refer to the son as Peppino, and then otherwise we have too many Benuris. And I know it's a strange name, and you have to think of that double L as a sort of Y sound, Benuri. Anyway, Benuri's son, Peppino, he also obviously goes off to Rome to study. And this is his view of Rome from the Spanish Academy of Fine Arts. It's rather a lovely view over the city, though I do rather like all the nuns in the immediate foreground, and sort of again reminding you of the fact that it is the holy city. But all roads lead to Rome, and the thing to remember is that he is there on a scholarship, so he is torn in different directions. He needs to paint to keep his money, to keep his scholarship going. He needs to send home the sorts of paintings that are expected of him. And you'll find this in the Palo de la Generalitat in Valencia, but I was saying that this is like the town hall. These are in the manorial offices, and so they are very rarely available to the public. So don't be surprised if you can't see them when you go to visit Valencia. But the important thing is that this is what the authorities wanted. They wanted history painting, they wanted serious subjects, and they were also supposed to be patriotic, sort of with nationalistic fervour. And Father Joffre founded the first psychiatric hospital, if not in Spain, or possibly the world anyway. It was a landmark in terms of mental health care. And if you look, there's a group stoning a madman on the right-hand side, and Father Joffre is trying to protect him. So it's your absolutely typical academic work, ticked all the right buttons as far as he was concerned, Sorolla was concerned. However, he needs to make money, and whilst the authorities want serious subjects taken from history, the general public wants something lighter. They want something to hang in their drawing room. So he's also got to think about his commercial market. So he develops the costumbrismo, which was something that had been put on the map by Mario Fortuny, who I introduced you to last week, who was at the forefront of 18th century costumbrismo, which took people out of the industrial milieu of the 19th century and was highly romantic. Everybody seems to be either coming out of the bull ring or going into the bull ring in their Sunday best. And you can see here what I mean by the colourful costumes, particularly the one worn by the lady, which always reminds me of the big Fallara celebrations held in Valencia in March. So, these are often in watercolours. They are relatively inexpensive, and he had several dealers that he signed contracts with, and one of his most lucrative markets opening up was in South America. So it's important that you don't sort of forget the important Spanish colonies that artists could see as lucrative markets. And it's just to show you that this costume barista was a major arts movement in 19th century Spain. And also the fact that they are small cabinet pictures. They're very much designed for a bourgeois market. So this is the Seville school of artists. Yes, it seems that Spain is very regional, but it has, you know, a Madrid school, it has a Barcelona school, we've got the Valencian school, and inevitably there would be a Seville school. In the case of the wonderfully named Francesco Peralta, Peralta, my Spanish, as you know, is always challenged. He goes to Rome and never comes back. I know that feeling well. So the important thing is that they left Spain, some came back, some stayed in Rome, others migrated to Paris, like Picasso. So here is a diversion in a taverna, and you can see what I mean about exploiting the whole bullfighting culture of Andalusia. I love the bull on the wall, his head, and the posters, and they're all in their best costumes, as you can see. And I'm sure that some of the men that we're looking at here are matadors. The important thing is that they were really sort of buying into this romantic image of Spain. So in Rome, clearly, you know, Sorolla is thinking about how he is going to make money from a popular artist. He wants to be, and there's nothing wrong with this, rich and famous. And the road to that is costumbrismo. So not surprisingly, here we've got an Italian version of it. So the little girl, as you can see, has got Italiana in her title. And you might think that the work on the left-hand side by Silvestro Lega is also Spanish, because you can see some very obvious similarities, particularly the rather sort of careworn wall behind our two figures. And they are both peasants, but they are very romantic peasants, aren't they? You know, rather, you know, cleaned up, shiny and polished and wearing flowers. And although their clothing may be a little dishabily, they don't look to be destitute. However, the work by Silvestro Lega is not Spanish. He's one of the Italian Impressionists. Yes, Italian Impressionists. So I imagine that when I put in my title, Painting Quickly Out of Doors, I was going to make a case for Sorolla being part of the great sort of development of arts in France. You know, we go through Delacroix, who is one of the pioneers of en plein air painting, Courbet, Barbizon's school, French Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, but a key ingredient the whole way through is en plein air painting. But the en plein air painting revolution occurs all across Europe. There is not a country that does not develop its own school of en plein air painters, and Italy is no exception. They have the difficult to pronounce name as of the macchia aioli, and it's the macchia part that's important. As you can see, it literally means in Italian areas of light and shadow. Perhaps because of their heritage, I'm thinking of Caravaggio and the idea of tenebrrism and Caravagesque, dramatic chiaroscuro, differences between light and dark. This is what makes Italian Impressionism slightly different. They have slightly different philosophy and outlook to the French Impressionists, who really emerge as a tour de force in 1874 with their first exhibition. Now, the macchia is a very large school of artists. We'd have to have a whole session, and I'm sure that these will be a discovery to you. But you can see what ties them together is en plein air painting. So Giovanni Fattori, who is a major macchia painter, is here actually depicting in the rain with his umbrella. That's an umbrella for shade, not a parapluie. Silvestro Lega, but the important thing in painting out of doors, directly from nature. That's all en plein air means. There's a lot of them. I'm just going to pick out Giovanni Fattori We've met Silvestro Lega already, and the wonderful Telmaco Signori, because these are all the artists that Sorolla would have been keeping an eye on in Rome in the 1880s, although their careers, as you can see, take off in the mid-1850s onwards, because these artists go to Paris, 1855, the International Exhibition, and they see the one-man show of Gustave Courbet. And that converts them to the new school of realism and en plein air painting. And they, as is so often happens in artistic movements, they all get together in a cafe. In this case, it's the Cafe Michelangelo, because this is an art movement very much based on Florence. Italy is only united in 1861. Initially, the capital is Turin, then it's Florence, and then it's finally Rome. So yes, you can see again, we have artists associated with those three capitals, particularly with Florence and with Rome. So down the bottom, also by Giovanni Fattori, you can see here again the whole development of coloured shadows and applying the paint in little dashes, the macchia, but very much to give this contrast of lights and shades. They look a merry band of brothers, don't they? I imagine hard drinking was part of their manifesto. Like many realists, the idea is that you don't paint history anymore. You want to paint scenes of contemporary life. And that can go in two directions. You can paint bourgeois life, beautiful ladies sauntering in the garden, as we can see here by Giovanni Fattori. And they are, if you want to see these paintings, there's a lot in Castelcello, but there's even more in Livorno. So if you're wondering where Livorno is, if you can think where Florence is and go towards the coast, that is where you'll find Livorno, because one of the artists settled there. So you could either go the bourgeois direction and be painting scenes of bourgeois life, or you could go to the peasant direction. This, of course, was the impact of the Barbizon school. So these are all by Fattori. The haystack is after 1872, and down below, it was an area again where this artist was particularly associated with, because the idea was you painted what was familiar to you, something that you felt connected to. So it was absolutely ideal that you went back to your home, say in the summer, and painted the local scenery that carried with it for you a sort of sentimental value. So Mara is a good example of that in the case of Fattori. And we have the two figures here asleep, having a siesta in the middle of the day, and the oxen in their cart in the background. So you either go rural peasant, very wholesome, sort of element really of purity to it, you know, because peasants have been uncorrupted by city life, or you go in the direction of bourgeois life, which, let's face it, was commercially the right direction to go in. This is Lega's masterpiece. And as you can see, it's very early. So we haven't even had Impressionism launched officially till 1874. But what you're going to find is if you look at painting in France in the 1860s, that this is the experimental phase of French Impressionism, with the two dominant artists actually in the 60s being Edouard Manet, not Monet, but Manet, and Edgar Degas. This, as you can see, is not yet painted in a free impressionist style. It's quite controlled, but look at the interest in light, the very bold shadows, and the way the shadows are picking up reflected light, and how bright the light is. So it hasn't got that dullness that I associate very much with the Barbizon school, where everything seems to be painted under a cloudy sky. This painting by Lega dates to 1868. Compare it to this by Basile from just 1 year before. You can see what I mean about the very strong connections between Italy and France at this time. Basile is again little appreciated compared to the big four, because he died in the Franco-Prussian War, and he was very much painting in this experimental phase. So So yes, there isn't the freedom of brushwork that we associate with Monet, but look at the bright colour, that blue sky, and the dappled shadows. These are all very much part of the breakthrough in the 1860s. And this breakthrough, this en plein air painting breakthrough, is all down to technology. The Americans had invented collapsible metal tubes, which meant that you could now go out and paint directly from nature using oils. This invention occurs in the 1840s. Our pioneer en plein air painters include Eugene Boudin in Honfleur and Yonkin. And all of this is possible because of this new technology. We've painted in watercolors out of doors for years, but you know, when you had to mix your own oils, it was pretty impossible to actually take those outside. Now, with the right equipment, you can travel and paint anywhere. So this is a little later on. So as I said, the macchia sort of emerged in the 1860s, and they're still going strong when Sorolla is painting in Rome in the 1880s. And my top example by Lega of a peasant is that rural life theme. But then down below, we have the bourgeois. And what is intriguing here is, I'm hoping you're noticing, different artists. The top one of the lady in the blue dress is by Adolfo Tomasi. That's in fact his sister who is being painted. And my reason for doing this is not to deliberately confuse you, but to show you that Silvestro Lega creates a school of his own, because he teaches the Tomasi family, and two of them become painters. So Lega is the top peasant, and the one below rather freely painted, as you can see, of her doing her sewing. And then the more tightly painted, looks like Tissot might have had a go at it, is by Adolfo Tomasi. And she sat there, as you can see, with her ball of wool and a much more sort of correctly rendered dog. And then on the left-hand side, these are also by Lega. The top one is actually a sketch. It's just showing you how you're moving to a freer, more fluid application of paint. And again, the importance of intimacy. So the garden scene down below of the family Dupré in the garden. So again, that sort of whole, you know, bourgeois lifestyle. So that's Lega. And this is Telemaco Signorini. And here he is painting out of doors directly from nature in Florence. I want again you to notice the chiaroscuro, sort of dramatic light and dark, the shadow underneath the awning, then the bright light spilling over the sort of yellowy coloured walls of the city, and the sort of milieu that is created of street criers, sort of a real sense of actuality. This is realism for you. And Telemaco Signorini is very important, a great influence on perhaps Italy's most important 19th century artist. We can have an argue about this later, Giovanni Boldini. Now, when I started to sort of do my swatting, I said to Susan, I feel like I could take an exam now in Sorolla. When I was doing my swatting for all of this, I was rather shocked. I knew Boldini very well, but I'd imagined that he was in fact more like Sorolla's age. Sorolla was born in 1863. So I was rather shocked to discover he was, 20 years older, 1842 to 1931. And crossing the street here, which is in the Clark Institute, wonderful museum in Massachusetts, I thought, my goodness, that Jean-Jacques Tissot, one of my favorite artists working in London in the 1870s. He'd fled from the Franco-Prussian War. Our beautiful street scene here, very upmarket lady holding flowers, obviously on her way to meet somebody, and then the colourful scene behind her, painted with almost photographic fidelity. So you might not have thought of Boldini, you might know about him from his later career as a very important portrait painter, rivaling Singer Sargent. In fact, in America, I think most women would rather have been painted by Boldini than even Singer Sargent. And he is regarded, this is Boldini, as the second generation of the macchia, so this idea of painting with spots of light and dark colour. And he was also influenced by Cristiano Banti, another of these painting outdoors quickly artists who are part of the Italian school. Again, I wanted to show you the importance of this whole idea of the bourgeois subject of ladies reading or sewing, but something domestic. That's the important thing. And here is Boldini at his best. So Scott would like the portrait of Cleo de Moreau. He's always had a soft spot for her. She was one of the it girls around 1900. She was a ballerina. She's Darcy Bustle, fabulously good looking, said to have been a mistress of Leopold, King of the Belgians. Absolutely stunning, and you can see that Boldini brings out the best in you. Both of these date to 1919, well, this one's 1901, and then Portrait of a Lady is 1885 by Boldini, and it's the sort of thing that might well have been seen by Sorolla whilst he was visiting international exhibitions in Rome, possibly Florence, and certainly Paris. We know that he went to Paris in 1889 as well as 1885. So he's going to know how successful Boldini has become, combining genre scenes, as we call them, scenes of everyday life, and portraiture. So portraiture will be very important for Sorolla too, as you'll see in just a minute. I couldn't resist leaving you with one of my favourite works by Boldini, The Spanish Dancer of 1900, and is in his fully matured swish style. Don't you love it when you can actually give an artist their own style? His was swish. That if you like, you know, I'm thinking of Russell, another artist of this era who develops a rather similar dramatic boldness. Boldini was bold. Russell Flint is who I'm thinking of. Anyway, back to Sorolla's story. So in addition to his education, and it was broad in both contemporary French and Italian art, the next landmark in his life is getting married. So whilst he's still studying in Assisi, so he's initially in Rome, then he moves up to Assisi to paint alongside his friend Ben-Uri. But he comes back from Italy in 1888 to marry the love of his life, Clotilde Garcia. That's her full name at the top. And she, of course, is the daughter of the man who took him in when he was but a mere stripling studying at the Academy of Fine Arts in Valencia. Garcia is a photographer. So we're starting off here with rather beautiful Spanish-themed images of Clotilde. It took me a long while to work out the title of Pila Adagio, because it means literally the chosen one, and it's a sort of rather fanciful image of Clotilde in Spanish costume, wearing her mantilla. As you'll see later in a minute, ladies, you're going to envy her waist. So he's waited to marry her, so he's going to have met her in 1879 when he is a teenager, and obviously he cannot marry her until he's in a financial position to do so, and that is in 1888. So we've got a lovely portrait of her in profile of 1884, down the bottom 1891, again in fanciful Spanish costume, and I love the one of 1888 where she's looking out of the window, again sort of wearing her Sunday best. Don't artists love that theme of the woman trapped in her home and then looking out of the window? And that's, by the way, the one of 1888 of Clotilde looking out of the window is in watercolor. So we don't really tend to think of Sorolla as a watercolor artist, but if you think about his later practice, that may be where some of the fluidity of his work comes from. So he comes back to marry Clotilde in Valencia, in San Martin. So when you go to visit Valencia, if you want to plot out places associated with Sorolla, this might well be on your list. As you can see, it was baroqued at some stage. And having met Clotilde and married her in Valencia, they will settle in Madrid when they return from Italy in 1889. I think the reason for this is simply one of financial opportunities. He thought that he was going to get more portraits and work if he painted in Madrid, the capital, than in provincial Valencia. And you can see here now that it's now the Sorolla Museum. The foundation was created through Clotilde. So after Sorolla dies, let's face it, young, he dies in 1923, it is Clotilde that keeps the flame alive. Then that baton is passed to his son, Joachim or Joachim, depending on how you like to pronounce it, and who never marries, by the way. We'll meet the children in a sec. And this is now the best place to see works by Sorolla. And I'm sure you can recognize some of your favorites already on the wall, as many of the very personal canvases of his family were never sold. Keep your eye on the lady in grey down here, because of course this is one of the early portraits of Clotilde. You know, this is beautifully painted, as you can see, in terms of giving us an accurate depiction of her appearance. Clotilde Garcia de Castillo is her full name. So this, of course, are her parents, painted by Sorolla. This is, in fact, in the collection back in Valencia, in the Belles Artes. And the thing to remember about these is how big they are. So there's the label over there. It's just to remind you that these are monumental works of art. And I think Antonio Garcia was a father figure. So we know that poor old Sorolla was orphaned at the age of 2. And he was then raised by his uncle, who he was very fond of. That rather lovely head of a girl painted in Rome was actually sent back to his uncle as a gift. So it wasn't that his uncle didn't, there was no bad blood between them. But obviously it was Garcia who gave Sorolla his first opportunity, working in the photographic studio, learning about lighting, staging, perhaps painting some of the backcloths, the scenery. It was Garcia who gave Sorolla his first opportunity. So here is one of the cartes de visite created by Antonio Garcia's studio in Valencia. And here they all are together. I always love this photograph because it looks very modern, doesn't it? Here they all are. Obviously, it's not. It's quite staged. But here they all are having dinner together. So Garcia is at the back here. This is Sorolla in the bentwood armchair. This is Clotilde. This is definitely Joachim at the end, who is Sorolla's only son. You can always identify him because he's never out of his suit. He was sartorially elegant from the get-go, as you'll see in a minute. And then I am assuming, and I'm not too sure, that these are Sorolla's 2 daughters. He was particularly close to his eldest daughter, who is Maria. So I love this, The Painter's Wife, not finished, but the important thing is this correlation between Clotilde as his muse, his wife and his muse. She was everything to him, as he tells us in many letters. General factotum, mother of his children, but most importantly also his own Mona Lisa, or in this case, Venus de Milo, which of course is the classical work that she's looking at. So it's this idea of Clotilde as just about his everything. So we don't have to worry about fares. There's nothing mucky to pull out of Sorolla's closet. We're not looking here at Rossetti or Burne-Jones and a stream of women. There is only one woman. It is Clotilde. One of his most famous portraits of her is this one, which is now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Ladies, I said you would envy her waist. I was not joking, was I? In this magnificent black ball gown. Oh yes, I'm looking at it now and thinking, where did my waist go? And most importantly, if you look behind her, there's a painting on a wall that Sorolla never sold. We saw it last week. As you can see, it has various titles. It's sometimes known as Saint at Prayer, sometimes Nun at Prayer, but with the halo behind, clearly we're looking at a saintly figure, and that's immediately behind Maria. So she's combining, you know, all these facets into one perfect woman. She is his Madonna as well as everything else. And famously, we have this photograph of Sorolla actually working on this portrait. So we're not making up her waist, as you can see. And there is the picture of the Madonna in the background. So here are some of, you know, that lovely quote from Sorolla about his wife Clotilde, his confidant, traveling companion. In the many letters that he sends to Maria when he's away from home, it usually starts with, "I wish you were here." My treasury minister, because she was the keeper of the purse, and his muse. So she literally was his everything. So it's the family arrives pretty quickly. By 1895, they have 3 children. Maria is born in 1890. This is her at the back. Joachim or Joachim, however you prefer to pronounce it. 1892, his only son, and Elena at the last. I love this image of all 3 of them. So this is Clotilde running after her 3 children, and the baby Elena is here catching her brother's dress, the hem of it. Remember, boys and girls are dressed the same initially until they're breeched. Pink was actually much more a boy's colour than a girl's colour. I know that's confusing. And it's because pink is a dilution of red, and red was very much a military colour and therefore masculine. And the staged studio photograph, I'm sure by Garcia, his father-in-law, sort of creates a sort of conversazione, doesn't it, amongst the figures, a conversation piece. Clotilde and the baby, Elena, are looking at us, but Sorolla is watching his son draw. That's the sort of typical conceit of the era. This is an extremely personal painting by Sorolla. It's simply entitled Mother, and it's the birth of his youngest daughter, and it's never left the family. This is in the collection in Madrid, and it's a sea of white, as you can see. Again, a sort of Madonna image, isn't it? Mother and Christ child theme. And not surprisingly, during the 1890s, as his own family is growing, the whole theme of family life is important to Sorolla. So this went through Sotheby's quite recently. Valencian family, it's in bright sunlight, and it was painted locally. We've been able to identify the local caves in the background. The father is here looking at the family, who appear perhaps to be unaware of him, apart from the baby, because he seems to have caught the eye of his youngest child over the shoulder of his wife. Look at the dappled shadows here on her dress and even her face, which is why I think he was very familiar with the macchia Italian artists. But this was their thing, you know, the chiaroscuro, the dappling of light and dark across the painting, slightly different to the French Impressionists. So I've reprised, as you can see, my carte de visite photograph, because it was obviously the prototype for this famous portrait of my family dating to 1901, which is still in Valencia. Elena, the baby, you see here, sat in the chair in front of her mother, but most importantly, the little boy is drawing. He might actually be, like, again, a conceit here. There's a lot of conceits going on here. He appears to be drawing his younger sister. And there is Sorolla in the background in the mirror. So this is just to remind you that he was very influenced by Velázquez. Was there any artist of the 19th century who wasn't? They were all into Velázquez. And another one we shouldn't forget is Frans Hals, who also had a very distinctive technique of applying the paint in long, colourful ribbons. You'll see what I mean later. Las Mañanas, it's just to remind you, it means the ladies in waiting. A lot of people just, you know, don't realise that we try to confuse you by unusual titles rather than a portrait of Velázquez painting the King and Queen of France. They are, of course, in the mirror in the background, and Velázquez is shown here again in his studio painting a giant canvas. rather like Sorolla is photographed on the beach at Valencia. So this portrait I've just been showing you, which is back in this, it's like the manorial rooms of the town hall, the Generalitat Valencia. This is just to show you how big again this portrait is. So he's, a lot of the things that Sorolla does is sort of take paintings out of their small cabinet size and it magnifies them into sort of a whole heroic scale, including the portraits of his own family. So this is an equally famous portrait of my children of 1905, but this was not finished, but something happened. Obviously Sorolla changed his mind because Maria and Joaquin are very beautifully painted. Do you see what I mean about him always in his suit? It's the same suit I think he was wearing in the photograph with all the family together. But the Elena, the young girl, the youngest daughter, as you can see, is unfinished. And this has been X-rayed, and we know that in fact he originally intended to include Clotilde somewhere about there. So it wasn't going to be just my children, it was going to be my family again. But he changes his mind. So you can see that her face is now cast in shadow, and this is the corner of the canvas. So again, it's very much linked back to that big Velázquez painting, Las Mañanas. She looks really bored, doesn't she? Oh God, I've been made to sit again, which again, I think perhaps has given a sense of intimacy to what would otherwise be a rather formal portrait. Perhaps that was one of the reasons he left it the way it was. That sort of that look of despair. Oh God, have I got to sit still for another couple of hours? Most importantly, it's been related by many art historians or compared to the famous portrait by Singer Sargent of the daughters of Edward Darley Boyd, which lives in Boston, by the way. I mean, much ink has been spilt over this, the sort of strange way in which the children are separated and the enormous size of the vases, which I can report have survived and are actually shown next to the portrait. Each child appears to be in a little separate bubble. Clearly the impact of photography here can be, is very obvious to see. But you can see how Sorolla would have been measuring himself up against Singer Sargent. They were good friends. There's correspondence between them. There's correspondence also between Sorolla and Anders Zorn, who was Sweden's answer to Singer Sargent. And you can see a lot of Singer Sargent's Zorn tricks in his portraits. So this one here of Clotilde seated on the sofa, that unusual viewpoint of looking down at her. Very good, by the way, ladies, for getting rid of your double chin when you look up towards the camera. And that's exactly what Sorolla is doing here with his beautiful wife, Clotilde, who I'm sure has got no double chins. And to the sort of, again, rather beautiful historic setting, the antique furniture. Just the way that Singer Sargent liked to depict his wealthy American patrons. And then on the other side, Maria. I love this portrait of her in the white dress. White on white, artists really loved this challenge. And you can see Maria Clotilde, that's obviously her name and the date, 1900, in the tiles at the background. So I think Marie was a bit of a favourite. Her health was something of a worry. She suffers from tuberculosis. 1905, 1906, they take her to recuperate to El Prado, which is an area, a mountainous area, I understand, relatively close to Madrid. And I love this painting of her recovering. She's now a convalescent. Again, reminds me of some of the works by Jean-Jacques Tissot, his lover, Mrs. Newton, as you know, died in the end of TB. She was only in her late 20s, and this was the scourge of the 19th century. But the photographic qualities here again are obvious. How close she is to the picture frame, and then falling away to this very minimalist background. And I'm showing you it here in the frame to show you that I'm not making it up. I haven't sort of like cropped a detail out of it. This really again has a sort of photographic immediacy, and this painting is in Valencia. So I'm pleased to report that she recovers. Maria, I mean, from her TB. She will, she'll grow up, she'll get married, you'll meet her husband in just a minute. So here they are in the garden of the Sorolla's home in Madrid, which we'll look at next week. Because after Sorolla has a stroke in 1920, he largely becomes housebound until his death in 1923. And like Monet, he focuses all his attention on painting his garden. So I thought that would be a nice way to sort of end our time together, that we would do the Visions of Spain. That's his big project for Archer Huntingdon. It's probably that led to a decline in his health. It was such a monumental project. He then, only a year after completing it in 1919, he has his stroke, and then his final years are spent in his garden in Madrid. So this is the garden in Madrid. We'll be looking at this in greater detail next week. One of his innovations was to take portraiture out of doors. Now, with his own family, this was not a problem, but actually doing commissioned portraits out of doors, another kettle of fish, as you'll see in a minute. And it's these images, in fact, of Clotilde and Maria. It's one very famous one, walking on the beach. I think are archetypal images of Sorolla. The practicality of it, we won't go into, walking on the beach completely in white, in these wonderful dresses with the water lapping at your feet. And probably totally impractical, but it creates a wonderful image, doesn't it, of the swirling veils and their parasols. It's obviously quite windy, a wonderful sense of vibrancy and immediacy, very Japanese print with no horizon, and the sort of photographic instantaneous quality, which we'll talk about next week when we do all of his paintings on the beaches of Valencia. He's also painting at San Sebastian and Biarritz, so we will take in the whole gamut. So Maria was quite a talented artist in her own right. So here she is painting at El Prado, again convalescing from her bout of TB. This is 1907 in date, and I'm beginning to think that he might have seen a work by Matisse. Look at those vivid purple colours in the background, the light here, I presume on a tree trunk. Certainly not naturalistic colour anymore, is it? And obviously the paint applied in a very fluid bravado manner, a style that actually becomes known as Sorollaism, the way in which again we have the dramatic light and dark, the full sunlight on Maria, but again you could not really describe this colour as natural. And again, this is in a private collection. So this is Maria painting. She was never a professional artist. She only, you and I think would describe her as amateur. There's nothing wrong with her art. There's an example of it. I say nothing wrong. It's quite competent. As you can see, you would describe her in the 1920s, which is what this Chula 1925 painting, which is now in Valencia, you would describe it as, very Sorolla-esque. Anyway, Maria paints, but Elena becomes a sculptor. So I've got a lovely photograph of her working on one of her projects. But they don't need to become, well, they don't enter into the professional world as they might have done. But they stay within the artistic gamut because in the case of Maria, she marries an artist. So this is Francesco Pons Arnaud. So this is going to be Maria's husband. You can see him here later in life. A rather lovely 1920s portrait of Clotilde drinking tea. Eating fruits and cherries are in Valencia. I couldn't resist showing you this work by Pons from the 1920s because it's just so Art Deco. This conversation piece of, again, drinking tea. I love it. But she's looking at you very knowingly, isn't she? I have a feeling that there's some interesting gossip going on there. And Pons is again often described as a pupil or one of Sorolla's followers. So as we move away from the family into his portraits of his friends, and he has a wide circle of friends in both Valencia and in Madrid, it's just important that you remember that portraiture is his bread and butter. That this was the obvious way to ensure that you could support your family and your lifestyle. So this is Sorolla painting the wife of Mariano Ben-Uri. So he's the sculptor. So there's the two brothers, Jose and I always want to say Mariano Ben-Uri. And this is the sculptor of the two brothers. And this is his second wife, who was a superstar in her own right. She was a very famous contralto. The portrait bust of her is by her husband, Ben-Uri, with their only son, who you see here in the painting by Sorolla. Very stately, as you can see, Ariana, with, again, that conceit from Velasquez of Sorolla painting their portrait in the background. And I love the little boy in his sailor suit. So we move into the world of portraiture. Now, the first successful portrait in terms of, ensuring that he got commissions was this one of Augustin Ottoman, a famous but also a friend who was a fellow artist. So you can see his canvas here in the background. So we have a painter painting a painter painting. I love that idea. And he's here preparing his palette. And you see, I was mentioning all the tubes of paint here. You see how he's squishing all the tubes of paint. And this meant that you actually kept the colors separate. You didn't mix them and you apply them directly, alla prima, as we call it, onto the canvas. And this idea of sort of creating portraits that went beyond portraiture, that have a narrative to them or reflect the character or the profession of the sitter, was one again of Sorolla's specialisms. So I was having a lot of difficulty pronouncing Aureliano's surname yesterday. I do apologize. But most importantly, he is a major figure in Sorolla's life. So this is this idea of how he paints people in his close circle. And Aureliano was a really important landscape artist in his own right. He was also an art critic. He wrote the first biography of Sorolla in 1898. He also sat on several important juries and ensured that Sorolla came away with the top prizes. So all round, Aureliano was a really important figure in his life. He turned down, his Aureliano, he turned down being curator of the Prado. This shows you how entrenched he was within the establishment, but his son will grow up to run the Prado. And you can see one of his portraits, one of his landscapes in the background. And we think that Sorolla painted somewhere around 500 portraits. So this is another side to his art that you might not have thought of. So this is a classic example of Aureliano's work. I love trees. And you can see here again, probably more I don't know, it's very bright, isn't it? I was going to say the influence of the Barbizon school. They loved painting oak trees at Fontainebleau. But the bright light, of course, belies the influence of the French Impressionists. Really, this is 1909, and if it's going to be influenced by anybody, it will be the emergence of the Fauves under the banner, under the leadership of Matisse. Another really important figure in Sorolla's story, Vicente Blasco Ibáñez, who is not a painter but a writer. Now, I have not dwelled on the history of Spain in the 19th century because you really would get a pain in the head or a pain in the neck. But we have a very strong anti-monarchy faction going on throughout the 19th century. People wanting a republic. Doesn't happen until the 1930s, obviously. And Blasco was at the heart of this. He is a nationalist. He founds a really important radical paper, El Pueblo, meaning the people, and he asked Sorolla to produce the advertising poster for it. As you can see, the young lady there in her revolutionary Phrygian cap. He worked in Valencia, and his house, which is on the beach in Valencia, Malaporosa, is now a house museum dedicated to Blasco and his circle. So you'll find works by Sorolla there. So this is his portrait by Sorolla, and this is his bust by Mariano Ben-Uri. And if you really want to sort of get into the Spanish psyche, then you need to read these novels by Blasco. He's Spain's answer to Emile Zola. They are realist novels about life in the countryside, life in the city. The most popular ones are actually situated with Valencia as a background, rice and carriage, the farmhouse among orange trees. Can't get more Valencian than that. Canes and clay, and several of the novels reflect his very strong anti-clerical feeling. Next week we will deal with the theme of Black Spain, the Inquisition, and this sort of going darker shadow hanging over Spanish life, and which of course Blasco would put firmly at the feet of the Catholic Church, which repressed the Enlightenment in Spain in the 18th century. So you can see here, this is how I'm trying to put over this idea that Sorolla's portraits are a bit different, often reflecting, the career of the sitter. So this portrait of Dr. Simaro is a good example, as we see him here engaged in his scientific activities, looking down his microscope, literally. Again, this was another very successful portrait when it was shown at public exhibitions. Some of the portraits have had, because we don't perhaps value them as much as we should do. So these were separated out of their frames and only been recently conjoined together. You'll find them now in Valencia. This is another side to Sorolla, one of his very rich industrialist portraits from the Granzau family of Polish descent. But, he marries into an aristocratic, as you can see, family from that wonderful name, Maria del Pilar de la Cerda, later Countess Villar. So, you could compare these characters to sort of Lord Leverhulme back here in England. Captains of industry is what I'm trying to put over. It's quite, a lot of portraits are a bit stodgy, aren't they? But I love the little boy. The little boy is just, he's just so engaging, isn't he? The rather impish way that he's looking directly at you from the canvas. And next week, when we learn about Sorolla in America, you're going to appreciate how he takes on the big boys. Anders Zorn was immensely popular as a portrait painter in America in what you and I would call the Edwardian period, alongside Singer Sargent. So I thought the best way was to do a comparison. This is Zorn. Zorn's Swedish, remember. He's Sweden's most famous painter. I know you're all thinking of Carl Larsson, but Larsson is in a sort of different category. Zorn was the big, portrait painter, really famous international standing, got these big juicy commissions. President Taft, who you're looking at here on the left, is by Zorn, and the one on the right in brown, or more brownish hues, is by Sorolla. And he made a fortune in America, charging as much as $5,000 for a full-length portrait. So we were having a discussion yesterday about, how to see a Sorolla. And as far as I was aware, the Princess Beatrice of Battenberg was the only Sorolla in the UK. It's in the National Portrait Gallery, but remember, it's from the Royal Collection, but remember that temporarily that is closed, not because of COVID, but because it's having a major overhaul. But in fact, somebody then, contacted us and said that there is a Sorolla in the National Gallery of the Drinkers. I just haven't had a chance yet to check that out. Whichever way you look at it, there are not many Sorollas in England. So if you want to see them, you need to go to Valencia. So perhaps we might look ahead at some stage to arranging a holiday for 15 of you. That's the minimum number that I can take for travel edition. So we could do a double header. We could go to Valencia and spend 2 or 3 days there, and then take the high-speed train to Madrid and go to Sorolla's studio house. Anyway, Princess Beatrice and Queen Victoria Eugenie is to introduce the heir. Here, a wonderful portrait of King Don Alfonso. swashbuckling hero, as you can see. But my reason for including this at 1907, there's also a version of 1911, is it's out of doors. And this was against a real novelty, actually having a portrait out of doors. And I have to say, the first time I saw a Sorolla was not at the National Gallery exhibition that was very recent, but the big garden exhibition that they had at the Royal Academy a few years ago, which was this wonderful outdoor portrait of my favourite American artist, Louis Comfort Tiffany, here painted on Long Island at his wonderful house, Laurelton Hall. Don't you love all those flowers in the background? I certainly do. Anyway, to get back to our main theme, so the last 10 minutes that we'll have together, I want to concentrate now, back with Sorolla, on his social realist phase. In some ways, this is only a short phase, but it's an important one, and it leads him to his recognition with Sad Inheritance, which wins the Grand Prix at Paris 1900. This is another Marguerite. I always want to say another Margarita, but you'd like to give her one, wouldn't you? Because you feel very sorry for her. It is a pathetic story of a young girl who's been arrested for infanticide. This was a horrible subject, but typical of social realism, that no longer wanted to depict the working classes as somehow a jolly lot who worked hard, had a beer after a hard day's labour, and it was all hunky-dory. I mean, the social realists want to peel back the hypocrisy of society. They want to get down and dirty, literally into the problems facing the working classes in the 19th century. It's like an Emile Zola painting, an Emile Zola novel painted. Marguerite was also the heroine of the opera Faust. So a well-read audience would get that title quickly. They would know immediately that she had killed her child. Though in the case of the Faust opera, Faust, of course, has raped Marguerite, or has seduced her, I should say, and that's the reason for her killing her baby. You know, it's a sort of Medea element, like Jason and Medea. And according to Sorolla, who actually saw this incident on a third-class railway carriage between Madrid and Valencia, so again has a sort of reportage feel to it. And you feel very sorry for her, at least I do, as she is a victim of circumstance. How would he have got such a hard-hitting subject? Again, because he would have been looking around him like he was looking at the Macchia painters. He's now in the late 80s and early 90s, looking at the other artists adopting a social realist position of not painting pretty peasants anymore, but the plight of the working classes. So he might have seen this by the wonderfully named Ludwig Hensingen, though this is Danish, and so technically I should remove all those G's. I do have a bigger problem with Danish than I have with Spanish. I do apologise. But the important thing was that this was shown at Paris 1889. That's the year of the Eiffel Tower International Exposition, murder of a child. And here the authorities are digging up the baby. She's under arrest, the poor sheepdog. She's obviously, like our Marguerite, found herself in an impossible position. So casting around himself, he is looking for a serious subject. He doesn't want to paint history anymore. That's now seemed to be rather played out. But he's still got to attract the attention of the jurors. When you're presenting at an international exhibition, to get the medal, you've got to have you've got to have the support of the authorities. You've got to give them what they want, and what they want is, it may no longer be history painting, but it's got to be serious, it's got to have a message, ideally it's got to have a moral. So Sorolla would have been looking at his friends and contemporaries, and José Jiménez Aranda was both a friend and a contemporary. This is simply entitled it means a disaster, a literal translation. And Jiménez Aranda is one of the Seville school of artists, okay? He went to Rome in 1871 and was influenced by Fortuny's costumbrismo pieces, okay? But then he's in Paris for 9 years, from 1881, where he would have fallen under the spell of Bastien Lepage and social realism. And he's a close friend of Sorolla in Madrid before, unfortunately, both his wife and child die, probably due to a cholera epidemic, and he returns to Seville. So in case you're trying to work out what you're looking at here, this is the disaster. This is before health and safety, clearly, and somebody has fallen from the scaffolding. They're looking up, they're looking down, there's a woman that can't bear to look, there's a guy over here who's already emotionally disturbed. The nurse here is trying to stop the child from seeing. There's a street urchin there, running forward. We can't actually see, it's very clever painting. Again, it has that reportage feel to it. But from the way they're all hurrying down here the ladder, the impression is that somebody has fallen and is either very badly hurt or dead. So this is the very dramatic, as you can see, portrait of Sorolla by Jimenez, Jose Jimenez Aranda. I'm making these distinctions because his brother, this is in the Aranda family, is also a really important artist. Honestly, do they just stop having a genetic gene here that sort of makes brothers, whole families, take up some sort of artistic practice? But anyway, Sorolla and Jimenez Aranda paint each other, but this is Aranda's portrait of Sorolla. He's now in his late 30s in Madrid. It's about 1901 in date. And it was very much, again, Aranda had a great impact on Sorolla's art, introducing him to Fortuny. He's a bit older, wiser shoulders, and the most famous work, in fact, famous work by Jose Aranda is this one here called Pass in the Bull Ring. And again, it's the same idea. Can you see, you're looking at a disaster, but you can't actually see what the disaster is. They're all looking over there. The horse is bolted. You know, the matador obviously is either dead or injured. There's been some, you know, dramatic incident, but we don't actually get to see it. It's sort of off screen. It's a wonderful portrayal of Seville, as you can see in the background. So this is his brother, I'm so sorry, Luis Jimenez Aranda. And this is a wonderful portrait of a lady at Paris 1889 with the Eiffel Tower behind her. When I saw this, I fell in love with it. It reminds me again of Jean-Jacques Tissot, who can so, you know, beautifully capture these elegant bourgeois ladies. So this is, you know, I wanted to include this because this is how they all get to know each other. It doesn't matter whether you're from Seville or Barcelona or, you know, or Valencia. You're going to meet each other at the national exhibitions held in Madrid, but then you're going to meet each other all over again in Paris, where the really big exhibitions take place, at the annual Salon, or here, of course, at the big 11 years in between international exhibitions. And Luis Jimenez Aranda's most famous painting is simply entitled The Doctor. So that's the full title there, but it abbreviates to The Doctor, 1889. And you can see here all of them have come to inspect this poor young girl. I hate to think what's wrong with her, but this is social realism. This is not, I'm afraid, you know, has a reportage shock factor to it, again revealing what it's really like to live in the 19th century. And this is by Santiago Rusiñol, who is one of my favorite artists working in Barcelona. And if you want to ask me more about these schools of Spanish painting at Seville, Barcelona and Valencia, we can do that in our questions. The important thing is you can see that everybody in the 1880s is engaging with social realism, the darker side of living in an urban environment in the late 19th century. So I'm hoping that you can see that I've really contextualized another Marguerite for you. And he continues with this theme of, you know, the fallen woman or the woman in extremis in white slave trade, which is our group of prostitutes, again in a third-class railway. We could write a novel about that, couldn't we? Under the watchful eye of their madam, which in Spanish is a Celestina. And she's wide awake, but the young girls have all, you know, and you can see that they're prostitutes because of their tawdry finery, as you can see. And again, dramatically painted, the foreshortening of the figure here, again, showing off Sorolla's technical skill. And everybody wants to paint prostitutes at the end of the 19th century. I mean, it's a major theme. It's in all the plays, you know, it's this double standard, you know, you have a wife and then you have a mistress, and then there's the Moulin Rouge where you go out to play. This is Boldini again. Now remember, he's Italian, but of course, everybody wants to jump on the bandwagon of sort of painting the flesh pots of Paris. And this is the Moulin Rouge was the most famous flesh pot. This is really showing the darker side of prostitution. This is Toulouse-Lautrec's famous image of the girls about to be inspected in the Rue de Moulin, where the Moulin Rouge is, obviously. And you know, there were very tough laws. Remember Josephine Butler? It's always the woman's fault, and the girls were inspected regularly to see that they weren't carrying any venereal diseases. And the girls are lining up here for their police inspection, which absolutely brutalizes you, as you can imagine. And in the Christian Krogh, who is, by the way, Norwegian, he's picked up on this theme. He wrote a novel about Albertine. She's here to see the police surgeon. She's this shy figure in the background. She's sort of found herself in this impossible predicament of becoming a working girl, and she's now facing seeing the police surgeon, which you can almost see as an act of rape, and psychologically many women never really got over it. But in the foreground here, we've got the, you know, the very successful, almost courtesan level of prostitution in her all her finery, and she's familiar and you know, resigned to her fate, but also you can see that she's quite cocky with it. You know, she's sort of like, oh, yeah, no, I've done this, been here, done that. You know, just got to get through it, and then we'll be back to work. It's that sort of, again, show of confidence. So again, it's like painting. You know, a lot of these paintings are more like novels in paint in terms of the complex narratives that they are telling. And we have a little batch again. These are my last few slides, you'll be relieved to know, all, you know, to do with Sorolla again and social realism. Like this poor lad here, who's got a fish hook in his side, and who might never recover from it. There's no out of doors painting here. There's no light and dark. It's quite claustrophobic. There's a dramatic shaft of life coming in. It's more the chiaroscuro of Rembrandt or Caravaggio in the sort of contrast of light and dark. Everything focuses on the narrative story and the title, and they say fish is still expensive. So it's going to emphasizing the hard life of being a fisherman. How apt at the moment. And then in 1894, the big breakthrough. The big breakthrough is this painting, which translates literally as returning up from fishing. And there is no moralizing anymore here. There is no even obvious narrative. We are now about to make the big switch. We're going to leave the sermons behind, and we are going to concentrate on capturing the luminism of Spanish light. And that term luminism will be very much appended to Sorolla's later works, as we'll see. We're going to look at all the beach scenes next week, and then the visions of Spain, and they are all classified as his luminist works. Luminoso and Sorollaism, they're basically the same thing. It's really when the subject of the painting is the light itself. So this was shown at the Paris Salon of 1895 and was an instantaneous success. Obviously shows the influence of photography. You can see how big it is, again painted on a heroic scale. And the Marquis de Loya gives us a good idea of how everybody recognized this was a pivotal moment in Sorolla's career. So we will end with our quotes. There is a moment in every artist's career which usually follows many years of strenuous effort, in which experiences are accumulated in an intuition of marvelous clarity. It's like Monet said, the veil had been ripped aside. That was when he started to paint with Buddha. The artist's vision becomes precise and clear. The paths that led to success are firmly perceived and easily and happily pursued without any effort at all. For Sorolla, this moment arrived with his first beach scenes, returning from fishing and a Valencian fisherman. And again, my image is just to show you how monumental it is. Continuing the Marquez quote, these paintings do not resemble any of those he'd painted before, and in all of them we find the vigor of the best Spanish painting. From this point onwards, the subject matter is of no importance. Of no importance. Sorolla sees only his personal interpretation of light, shadows, and the soft and rich penumbra interpreted by reflections of the sun through foliage and fabric. And I know you might have thought that my bit about the Italian Macca painters was a digression, but I think he gets a lot of his ideas from them. What does Macca mean? But blobs of light and dark, not just by looking at French Impressionism. So hopefully I have sort of broadened your horizons in terms of the sources of Sorolla's unique style, his luminism. And here's a beautiful study of just the little boy on the end of watercolor that recently went through Bonham's. There are 16 studies. This is him, as you can see. I love the studies. They're often better than the final works, aren't they, in terms of their immediacy. But you also wanted to emphasize the importance of photography in all these works. So what I want to end with is the beach at Malvarosa, which is very much associated with Sorolla. This is where he will now return to Valencia on a regular basis to paint bull fishing, as it's referred to, where the bulls, pull the boats out of the sea, and they had an entire sort of area of the beach devoted to keeping the bulls, because they were exhausted by their labor. But he'll paint at other beaches, Biarritz, San Sebastian, Java, and Cabanal is another. Cabanal is another beach that he will paint at, which we will have a look at. But I just want to end with another very famous beach, which is this one at Skyen. This is Croyer painting on the beach at Skyen. And this is much earlier. This is 1882. So we'll have a look at the Skyen painters next week as fishing beach scenes, not bulls, obviously, but bathers, very important parts of the Skyen artist oeuvre. To see again that Sorolla is not alone in painting under a bright summer sun, though obviously we're looking here at the top of Jutland, so not quite the intensity of sunlight that you have in Spain. But I want to show that Sorolla again is very much part of his milieu, and he would have discovered Croyer when he went to Paris in 1889, where Croyer took away the Grand Prix, the greatest prize, and he exhibited three famous, three beach scenes. So this again would have inspired Croyer to do what one of his mentors would have suggested, Bastien Lepage, mentor in the broadest sense of the word. He saw Bastien Lepage's retrospective in Paris in 1885. But Bastien Lepage, Jules Bastien Lepage, always recommended that artists paint what they know. And he knew the beaches of Valencia well, and we'll see next week that they become his most important topic in what you and I would call the Edwardian period, opening years of the 20th century. And that will lead up to his great success of the Visions of Spain, these huge canvases painted for the Hispanic Society of America, for Archer Huntington. And then we will end our time together rather aptly relaxing in the garden of Sorolla's beautiful house in Madrid.